Welcome everybody to one more Authors at Google Talk. Today with us is Seth Siegel, whose new book, Let There Be Water, has just been published. Seth Siegel is a writer, activist, and serial entrepreneur. He's the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Let There Be Water, Israel's Solution for a Water-Starved World. Siegel's essays on water and other policy issues have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and the leading publications in Europe and Asia. Siegel is the co-founder of several companies, including Beanstalk, the world's leading trademark brand extension company. He's a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. Siegel is married and lives in New York City. This book is a timely book for us people living in California. Obviously, there's been a very dry couple of years. But I wanted to say one more thing about the book. It may sound that it applies only to water. I went through the book, and this book actually applies to all sorts of hard problems that societies may face. And so the techniques and recipes and sort of methodologies that are presented in the book apply well beyond just the problem of water. With this, please welcome Seth Siegel to Google.
Thank you very much. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. I would take a second to tell you the story of how I came to write this book. Boris, in his kind introduction, mentioned that I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and about 3.5 years ago, I happened to be randomly at a session there when I learned that there was a coming global water crisis. And I thought to myself, I'm a pretty well-informed citizen. How come I'd never heard that before? And I thought it might be that maybe there was a gap in my reading, or maybe it was a gap in the media. But whatever it was, I was eager to find out a little bit more. I went back to my office, and since I am here at Google, I can say I went on to Google, my favorite search tool, and started, I won't use the word inappropriately, and started utilizing Google to find what I could learn about the coming water crisis. Now, during this presentation that I sat through, the speaker was an interesting fellow. He was a retired Air Force general who now served in a leading position in the National Intelligence Council in Washington, D.C. And he had just completed a project which had been classified and then had just been declassified that came to conclude that 60% of the world's landmass and 40 of our 50 U.S. states would, by the year 2025, which now is only 10 years away, would be experiencing some degree of water scarcity. Now, this was before anybody was thinking about or talking about the California drought, so this was not sort of uppermost in my mind at the time. What did occur to me, though, is that if we have a problem coming of such extraordinary scale as 60% of the world's landmass is going to face water scarcity, and 80% of the United States were going to have water scarcity issues, it struck me as essential that our policymakers and concerned citizens should know about that. And I thought to myself, if I don't know about this, probably lots and lots of other people who I thought should know about it don't know about it. And so over the following days and weeks, I did a couple of things. I continued utilizing Google as a search vehicle for, I love this new terminology I'm using rather than ing at the end of that word. I found myself continuing to read more, but I also found myself asking well-informed friends and some public officials who I regard as friends and colleagues. I started asking them to explain to what degree they understood the water problems that we had that were coming and what they understood we needed to do to get out of it. And what I was not so surprised to discover was that the level of awareness was practically at the exact same level as the level that I had had just a few days earlier when I heard the exact same frightening news. So here's what seems so strange to me, that when we have a water main break and it leads the evening news in our town, we think about water for a day because maybe water gets shut off. Or when E. coli gets into our water supply and we have to boil everything, we think about our water. Or when there's a pronounced and prolonged drought, we think about it. But if in fact this guy's presentation was so daunting, and I'll get into in a moment some of the reasons why he said we would be facing these problems, and it was going to be so prolonged, why are we not doing more, and why are we not asking of our public officials to do more? So what I learned in the coming days after I began doing some more research was that this is a serious problem. It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse widely. But that we're not in a situation necessarily where we're doomed for a Mad Max, if you saw that movie, kind of end of days, where everything will be desert and we'll all be fighting over water. And the reason why I came to conclude that is that there's a model for somewhere in the world where water actually is well managed, and that is Israel. So Israel is 60% desert. It has about the world's fastest growing population. It's grown tenfold in population since independence in 1948. It has among the world's fastest growing economies, growing 70-fold also in that same time period, which is just remarkable because generally speaking, when you look to see if the country is going to have water problems, you think of a couple of different metrics. One is population growth, two is economic growth, and in both of those, Israel should be in the red zone of problem. The third area that you might look at is what is the natural amount of rain or water that you have. And Israel, because of climate change, had fallen in amount of annual rainfall by about 50% in the years since 1948 till present. So you put all that together and you find out that Israel has such an abundance of water that it finds itself now able to export water to its neighbors in the West Bank, Palestinians in the West Bank, neighbors in Gaza, and to the Kingdom of Jordan on the other side of the Jordan River. So it seems almost incomprehensible that they are able to do that. And then you learn a little bit more, you discover that they have a robust multi-billion-dollar agricultural export industry. Now, what is agriculture basically? It's value-added water. I mean, we don't think of it in those terms, but that's what it is. It's value-added water. And only a country that would be so comfortable and confident that its water future was secure would think to build a large, broad-based agricultural industry that goes more than just feed their own people. And yet Israel had done that. So I became curious as to how and why that happened. So I want to share with you a little bit, and given the interest by the audience, obviously open it up to questions and have some conversation as well. So it starts quite a long time ago. And what we know is that, not in every case, but in many cases, what people want, what people focus on, is what people will achieve. And so why has Israel been a success in water where other parts of the world have failed? So let me start with a little bit of historical perspective. The founding prophet of Israel was not David Ben-Gurion or Chaim Weizmann, the first president and prime minister of the country, but a man named Theodor Herzl. Herzl was a largely assimilated Jew living in Austria. He was a novelist, a playwright, an essayist, and a journalist. And he got assigned to cover the Dreyfus trial in the late 1890s in France, where he learned of a French officer who was railroaded, framed, and sent off to a terrible fate because he was Jewish, a Jewish officer in the French army. And this had a remarkable and galvanizing effect on Herzl. He had this epiphany, this remarkable moment where the salvation of the Jewish people, he said, would be their own homeland. And that's where the Zionist idea, the political idea of political Zionism begins. Now, what's remarkable about that, and I won't get back to Herzl further, but I just wanted to give you some context for who he was and how important he is in the consciousness of Israelis today. Herzl writes, as I said, he was a novelist. Herzl writes a series of essays and novels trying to describe this new land that he envisions some years hence. And he writes a book called Alt Neuland. And in this book, in the voice of one of the main characters, a protagonist, he has him say that the heroes of the new country will be the water engineers, which I found absolutely remarkable when doing my research and reading. Why? Because why would somebody think, writing in 1902, that the heroes of a country that he couldn't even imagine when it would be formed would be the water engineers? And I'll share another small insight with you as well about this, and that is that the other day, I had reason to reread the Nobel Prize lecture given by Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin had been the highly decorated Israeli soldier. He was the chief of staff of the Israeli army during the Six-Day War. And Rabin, after his military career, ends up going into politics and on several occasions was elected as prime minister of the country. He was a hero, much beloved, and assassinated a few years after winning the Nobel Peace Prize. by a Jewish terrorist. Rabin, in his Nobel Prize lecture, says, "I did not mean to become a soldier. I did not mean to carry a gun. My plan when I was a boy was to become a water engineer." So once again, we find that here are people from the earliest days of the state to the more contemporary days of the state thinking to themselves about how water plays a part in society. And so the good news is that water is not just water. Water plays a large role in the economy. Water plays a role in society, in the way we organize ourselves, in the way we make options and choices of what's most important and less important in our society. And in the case of Israel, that exercise has been ongoing from the first days of the state through today. I'll tell you some of the successes they've had, but first I'd like to tack back and tell you a little bit more about what I learned and why we're going to a global water crisis. So you shouldn't think that I'm some alarmist who's out here just trying to hawk a book about water. So there are a handful of macro reasons why we are on our way to a problem. The first of which, and most obvious, is just simply the numbers. Population. We are globally, right now, about 7 billion people. The UN estimates are that we're going to 9.6 billion people over the next couple of decades. So if we are already stressed on our water supplies globally, I'm not just speaking about the US or California right now, but if we're speaking about our global water supplies and we're already stretched, I'll get into somewhat more so some of the worst places where we are most stretched, where they need it the most. If we're already stretched, how in the world are we going to do it and provide water for cleaning, for sanitation, for health, for food, for drinking? How in the world are we going to provide that when we're already stretched as we are? And here's the other piece of news about population. We're not just growing larger, we're growing more affluent. And one of the surest indices of affluence is water consumption. And that's not because of jacuzzis in your backyard or because you take an extra long hot shower, although that surely adds to the equation. The problem about affluence is twofold. One is diet, and the other one is the key part of your lifestyle. To be middle class, some of us may be vegan, some of us may be vegetarians, but in the main, people who are poor don't have animal-based diets, and in the main, people who are affluent do. Now, this has larger implications than just water, but for example, to take a pound of corn and grow that versus raising a pound of beef, and plenty of people, either you yourselves or people who you know, have beef on a regular basis, and probably very few of you just have some corn tacos as your sustenance on a regular basis. So a pound of corn versus a pound of beef is 17 times more water consumptive than a pound of corn. So once again, if 1 billion new people are going to become middle class around the world, that's a lot of cheeseburgers. That's a lot of people having a diet very different than their grandparents and parents had. And that's going to consume massive amounts of water that currently have not been identified. Now the boogeyman in all of this is clearly climate change. We don't know how extensive it's going to be, we don't know how deep it's going to be, but we know it's here. And whether you are a believer that climate change is man-made or not man-made, that's irrelevant to me. That's not part of this conversation, it's not part of the debate, and I don't need to get part into that discussion. What I do need to say is that climate change, of course, is just statistically a reality. Surface temperatures are higher in many places, and even where rainfall is identical in volume to what it has been historically, the intervals between one rain to the next rain are now longer. The soil is harder. When the rain hits, it doesn't get absorbed into the aquifer, into the underground storage facilities that nature gives us. And therefore, we lose as much as 90% of our rainfall now because these intense rainfalls come at longer intervals after the hard pack of the soil. So climate change is another factor, is that rain is not being absorbed. There's less rain in much of the world, and the rain is not being absorbed in the same way in much of the world as well. And then let's talk about pollution. We are increasingly and globally industrialized. And what does that mean? It means that in making this carpet, in making this podium, in making these chairs, there's all kinds of chemicals and there's all kinds of water being used in that process. Now, although we have a very good regulatory regime here in the United States with the Clean Water Act, inevitably, some types of chemicals end up finding their ways into our water. Whether it's the discharge from pills that we all take, or many of us take, whether it's from hairsprays or creams or soaps or shampoos that we have that get washed into our water systems. Our water systems are increasingly being polluted, and therefore water, large amounts of water, are being taken offline. And if this is not as grave a problem in the United States, although it is a problem in the United States, if it's not as grave a problem in the United States, I want to tell you it is as grave a problem as there is in Asia, China and India in particular. We're talking about billions of people who have highly tainted water. And then I'll share just two more macro things to mention. One is infrastructure. To a degree that I'm sure almost nobody here is aware, we lose incomprehensibly large amounts of water every day all over the world, even here in the US. So for example, on average, we lose about 30% of our water to leaks and infrastructure failures here in the US, 30%. So think about what that means. Water that we pump, water that we clean, water that's ready to go into your home, into your office, into your factory, whatever it is, gets lost along the way. Now, here in California, 18%, 18% of the state electricity bill goes to the sourcing of water, the pumping of water, the cleaning of water, and the discharge of water. 18%. So 30% of that 18% is lost, meaning that lots of carbon fuels are emitted, lots of water is wasted needlessly, lots of expense is incurred because we have a failed infrastructure. And this is the case all over the world. We talk a lot about our crumbling bridges. We hear our presidential candidates talking about our crumbling bridges and our crumbling roads and our national infrastructure. But we hardly ever hear anyone talking about our crumbling water infrastructure. And that needs to change. We need to make this a higher priority of our elected officials. And then the final macro condition I'd like to mention to you all is urbanization. And why is that relevant? Around the world, many people are leaving their small villages and farms and moving to cities. And cities are growing outward larger and larger and larger. And why is that relevant? Because what makes up a city? A city is concrete and asphalt and glass and metal. And what is the common trait of all of those? Impermeability, water tightness, and that's good for those of us who are inside on a rainy day. We don't want to be living, in a teepee when it rains and we're getting wet every which way. But the bad news for our water supply is that then there's an impermeability also to the soil below us, and the water gets run off and goes to the sea. So let me take a few minutes and talk a little bit about what it is that the solution is to all of this. And in each and every case, the lesson is Israel. Now, I want to hasten to add two very important things. First of all, not everything that Israel has done is necessarily relevant to everywhere in the world. Because Israel's a small country. I have some maps here during the Q&A. Maybe I can show you some details. Israel's a small country. And so therefore, just in terms of scale, it doesn't do what needs to be done in some grand, large places. And the second thing I want to say is that Israelis are not supermen and superwomen. What they are is they're focused on a matter. They think about it a lot. They care about it a lot. And they have prioritized this for a very long time. And because they have prioritized it for a very long time, because they have dealt with water scarcity for a very long time, what this means is that as now the world is going into a period with larger population, more affluent population, more polluted water, climate change, less water flow, what this means is that the world now will have to face a situation very much like what Israel has been facing since it first started thinking about water in the 1930s, even before it was a state. Now, I'm not going to go into now the historical reasons and all that. We can do this either Q&A, and I have a chapter in the book that discusses that. But I will say that most of what Israel has done is relevant in at least one very profound way, and that is the focus and the planning. So what Israel does is, as I said, at a very high level of government, this is something that people think about. And corporate life in Israel, they think about water in a way that we don't yet hear. We will, but not yet. But until we do that, until we have widespread thinking about this issue, we're not going to be in a position we're going to fix this, because societies are always fighting for scarce resources. Does the money go to more schools? Does it go to more military? Does it go to more bridges? Does it go to more water? And we have to influence that. I think the most significant thing that Israel has done, aside from the technology, which I'll talk about at some length in a moment, is that Israel has radically transformed agriculture. And I talk about this in the book. I refer to it as revolutions on the farm. And I'll talk about a couple of things that Israel's done in particular. First thing is, around the world, where fields are irrigated, and the city dwellers don't think about the farm that much, but we have to, because this is where our water goes. On average, 70% of the globe's water goes to agriculture. That's what it is in the United States. 70% of our water goes to agriculture. And so we have to think about what techniques are we using. Are we smart about our water? Are we dumb about our water? And I would argue that a lot of our water is really wasted water. Specifically, the phrase flood irrigation. It goes back to the dawn of time. It goes back to the Nile River. And so what was done? You build channels, you build canals, you build trenches, and you divert river water or you divert lake water, or if you have enough technology to have a pump actually, you flood a whole field. You have your seeds down and you flood the whole field. And then some percentage of the water finds its way to the roots, it nourishes the plant, and then the rest of the water either dribbles pointlessly into the soil or more likely evaporates up into the sky. And it's lost. More than half of it's lost. More than 60% of it's lost actually. So Israel invented a system called drip irrigation. And what is drip irrigation? Just as the name implies, as flood irrigation implies it. Drip irrigation is a system that places generally subterranean, below the soil, but that would not be a very good photograph. So I have a photograph of one that's on land. You can see these little tubes. You may have seen them maybe in somebody's garden here and there. These little tubes, and they have very tiny drippers. And the drippers drip at regular intervals right at the base of the plant. And the water is absorbed into the plant, and just enough is used to nourish the plant. Now, this is such an effective device, and I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I just want to throw it out since I'm here. One of the great reasons why we have so much polluted waterways in the United States is because farmers, in the need for ever greater amount of yield, are planting on ever more marginal soil. So what they're doing is they're using more and more fertilizer and more nutrients to add to the plant. Now, why is that a problem? That's a problem because when the rains come at the end of the season, the leftover fertilizer, the leftover nutrients get washed away, get washed into rivers, and they remain there. And that's when you have these algal blooms that become terrible problems. It's the nitrogen, it's the fertilizer that is utilized, that becomes utilized as feedstock for the algae. And it blooms and it destroys waterways, kills off fish, kills off plant life, and so forth. But these long devices, these drip irrigators, are able to grow plants in a most remarkable way because you can turn to liquid your nitrogen and your other fertilizer, and you can drip very tiny amounts. You see the soil here. This is not high quality Midwestern soil. So in Israel, you can actually grow this in the desert, and this is a desert picture. You can see where you can see in the far area the desert, and you can see in the near area where the desert has been reversed by use of drip irrigation on sandy soil, like beach soil. It's not soil, it's just sand. And what they do is they have these tiny drippers that have water and nutrients, and this is a way to turn useless areas into valuable areas for countries around the world at a time when food security is going to become a problem. So drip irrigation is one great solution to our agricultural problem. A second solution is the reuse of sewage. Israel made a decision in the early 1950s that sewage was too valuable to simply treat and dump. So let me tell you what we do here, what we do right here where we're sitting right now. Sewage, in case you don't know what it is the water that comes out of your shower, your bath, your sink in your kitchen, your sink in your bathroom, your washing machine, your dryer, and, sorry to say, your toilet. It gets flushed, it gets flooded out of the house, it reaches a sewage pipe, it all comes together in one place, and under the US Clean Water Act, it's treated to an ultra-high level. It's fairly expensive to do this. It's treated to an ultra-high level so that you almost could drink it if you had to. You wouldn't want to do a lot of that, but you almost could. And then what do we do in the United States with almost all of that water? What do we do with it right here? We dump it in the Pacific Ocean. Why? It's perfectly good usable water. No one's being asked to put it into a drinking bottle and drink it, but certainly it's good enough to grow cotton with, or alfalfa, or other crops. So in Israel, they made the decision in the early 1950s that they were going to build a parallel plumbing system, a national infrastructure separate from their clean water system, separate from their sewage system, that would take the water after treatment, and instead of dumping it into the Mediterranean, they would then relocate it to where farms and fields are. So think about golf courses that are sucking up massive amounts of fresh, clean water at a time when we're running out of water. Think about the fact of how many fields there are that suck water out of aquifers. And we are running out of aquifer water all over the country and all over the world because we're not using our sewage water in an intelligent way. Now, this sounds like sort of a, I don't mean a funny way, it's sort of a dry subject, but coming to this decision was a heroic decision. Feeling comfortable with transforming your national agriculture with drip irrigation doesn't come easily. It's a heroic decision. Heroism, inspiring stories are overcoming what seems like insurmountable obstacles. And something that Israel did, and it's something that we can do. We can not only improve our economy, we can feel good about ourselves and have inspiring models for ourselves as well. And also what Israel did in the world of technology is that they made a decision to fulfill an early Zionist dream. The first prime minister of Israel was a man named David Ben-Gurion, and he was famous for expression that we will make the desert bloom. Well, this photograph on the wall shows that they did make the desert bloom. But what's also true is that they needed the water to do that. And Ben-Gurion spoke repeatedly, speech after speech, diary entry after diary entry, and I recount some of them in my book of how he came to think about this. But he didn't do the work. Inspiring, heroic engineers did all this. People who came up with great ideas that were thought foolish at first by many. I talk about how many people were rejected by their society, they were laughed at, and they plowed ahead. And so desalination was not entirely invented in Israel, but was largely invented there, and also had lots of innovations out of Israel. It's a global phenomenon now, it's a global industry now, but much of the greatest parts are in Israel. And here I'll show you Israel's largest of its 5 desalination plants. Now, I want to challenge the audience, and I was told not to ask anyone to speak without a microphone in front of you, but I'll repeat the answer. Can anyone tell me, I know Google people are smart people, so who can tell me what seems to be missing from this photograph? This is a desalination plant. And I'll give you a key phrase if no one raises their hand in the next second or two. What's missing? Daphne, is that Daphne? Daphne, what'd you say, the sea? Yeah, it's a seawater desalination plant that's about a mile inland from the sea. So they built a seawater desalination plant where there's no sea around, which just goes to show where there's a will, there's a way. They felt that the seashore was too valuable and that they didn't want to use that, and there was also some other development in the area they couldn't break through. So they built this desalination plant. Now, this desalination plant is the world's most efficient desalination plant. Despite the distance from the ocean, it produces water more cheaply than anywhere else in the world, desalinated water. It's the healthiest water you can possibly drink. It's healthier than water from a lake or a river. It's because it's already been treated. It basically needs no treatment. It's pure water. If you're a pregnant woman and you're worried about drinking well water because of nitrogen or other things that can affect your health, this is the opposite. This is about as healthy water as you could possibly drink. So it's really a remarkable thing. So today in Israel, if one could segregate, now this water is merged with the rest of the fresh water of the country, and if one could merge all together the water of the country, it would be over 85% of the household water of Israel now comes from desalinated sources, which is a great boost to the society and a great boost for the health of the country. So where does Israel's water come from? There's manufactured water and there's natural water. So think about that. As we go into a time when we may be facing severe water scarcity in a large number of places, when we may want to be thinking about using our water in a completely different way, it's good to know that there's a solution. And the solution is that you can manufacture your water. So here in Israel, about 27% of its manufactured water comes from the seawater. About 21% of the water comes from sewage water that's treated and then reused for agriculture. About 11% of the water is called brackish water. That's another Israeli idea which is relevant in some parts of the world but not everywhere, and that is they drilled deep into the desert. They said to themselves in the 1950s, if we drill deep for oil and gas, why can't we drill deep for water? And so they drilled deep into the desert sands. They found large, massive pockets of ancient aquifers way down in the soil. enclosed caverns of brackish water, which means slightly salty, slightly minerally water, and they have to desalinate it. And then they also have an industry no longer in active use where they take stormwater. Now, by the way, as part of that sewage, I did mention that they have a national infrastructure that they created, and it takes about at least 10 years to build that. Israel has over 200 sewage-treated, now clean water reservoirs where they store the sewage water, because sewage is produced every day in about the same amount, winter or summer, but farmers tend to need water more at one time of the year than the other, so you need to have a storage system all thought out, all developed, all nationalized. So in the US, we use about 7% of our water, we reuse about 7% of our water for agriculture, and in Israel, it's about 85–90% of the water is used for agriculture. Now, what's remarkable is that if you look at the smaller bar chart over here, you see that the aquifers represent about 28% of the water, and the Sea of Galilee 10%. So just imagine that just a couple of decades ago, that was all the water that there was. And that's all the water that there is in most of the world. So is it any surprise that when, maybe 2/3 of the water is now coming from artificial sources or manufactured sources, that we now have scarcity issues everywhere? Is it any surprise that we're overdrawing our aquifers? Is it any surprise that California was close to running out of its water in its aquifers in the San Joaquin Valley if it continued at the pace that it was going without any regulation? Far from where we're seated right now, in the high plains, there are 8 US states that are the breadbasket and the food basket of the world that grows the oats, the corn, the wheat, sorghum, other plants that are used for fodder for animals and for our breads and our grains for our cereals here in the US and all over the world. We all know that there's a huge, huge industry. But we don't think about how it is that agricultural industry got created. In the post-World War II era, the decision was made to let the US agricultural industry become a major exporter. And so millions of new acres of land were planted. But we said before, agriculture is value-added water. So they needed the water. And there is a massive continental-sized aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer, that lays beneath these 8 states. From the high Nebraska, a little bit to the west in South Dakota, a touch of Wyoming, and then straight down to West Texas. If you can visualize that in your mind's eye. So from 1950 to about 2000, US agriculture became the world's savior. Bumper crop year after year, endless amounts of exports, billions and billions of dollars of exports. But what was never discussed, certainly I bet no one here knows about, is that the aquifer underlying all that has been pumped drier and drier. About 1/3 of the aquifer got pumped out in those 50 years. From 2000 to 2012, approximately another 1/3 of this massive continental aquifer was pumped out. Now here's what I want you to know. The shortest guess is that the Ogallala Aquifer that I'm talking about here took 10,000 years to fill. So in less than a century, in California, the San Joaquin Valley, in less than a century in the Ogallala Aquifer, we have managed to deplete this. Now, if they stay on the current course, the US Geological Survey now says that by the year 2028, which sounds not that far away, really, the Ogallala Aquifer will be pumped dry. Then what? Now, we don't have to go down that route. We can be thinking about water differently. We can come up with technologies that don't even exist yet. The technologies that Israel has created are wonderful. The technology that Israel uses that they didn't create but that they use in full measure is wonderful. But everything that they're doing, we can learn from, and we can be doing the same, and we need to be doing the same, and we must be doing the same. So what's great about, I started the anecdote about Theodor Herzl and the heroes of the new land will be the water engineers, and I told you about Yitzhak Rabin and his Nobel Prize speech. And so I want to just conclude by saying that it's a real pleasure, it's a real honor, frankly, to have been invited here to speak at Google. And despite the fact that, it's not exactly a bus ride to New Jersey to come from Manhattan to speak here, the reason I wanted to come is that probably among the world's most brilliant engineers and the people who can most affect policy may well be sitting in this room right now. And so I really wanted to say, the reason I wanted to come here was I wanted to say to you all that this is a problem, this is a crisis And this is something that's not going away. And so, to the extent that we can, we need to think of solutions, and we need to make this part of the national conversation. I'll pause here. I'd be glad to answer any questions that you may have. I'm sorry, I have one more slide I want to do. Some of you may want to know is where does that water go? It's similar to what I said before, is agriculture is the biggest user of it, household use, industry, and so forth. But I will stop here and be glad to answer any questions that anyone may have about this. And thank you for your close attention. I appreciate it.
First of all, thank you for coming to speak. That was really, really informative. Why does California not do more desalination? Is it because it's not economical with the current policies where it's just sort of free or cheap to pump groundwater? Or is it too far from the San Joaquin Valley? I'm just curious as to why the economic drivers haven't been there.
Yeah, so the interest group, the answer is that there are strong interest groups. And so what ends up happening is that there's a fight going on, and has been going on for quite a while, between kind of 3 or 4 interest groups. The environmental groups, speaking on behalf of the rivers and the fish, the farmers, and the city dwellers. And there's also a legal structure throughout most of the US, but certainly in California, which allows very long processes that delay large infrastructure projects, not just water, to go forward. But that is one of them. And so the cost structure here has gotten very, very high because of the delays. So for example, down in San Diego, the same company that built that inland desalination plant that I referenced a few minutes ago has designed a state-of-the-art one in Carlsbad, California, right near San Diego. And it will open in November, I believe, next month. Now, in Israel, a smaller plant with more output took 4 years to build from start to finish. This Carlsbad plant has been over 10 years in process, and many of those years were spent in litigation. The cost of an Israeli desalination plant is about $400 million, which is totally amortizable. I had it wrong twice now, so you know what I'm saying. It can be amortized easily over the 25-year first life of the plant, and then there's a second life of about 15 years. I don't have to go into the economic structure unless you want me to. And in California now, the cost structure is such that it's going to be much harder to recoup, because it's gone from $400 million, which it is in Israel for building a comparable plant, to one now in the US, that plant costing about $1 billion. So it's a higher cost. That's first of all. Second of all is, you have it exactly right. Politicians do not like spending money on invisible infrastructure. So your question sort of had an implication of that. So politicians, mayors, governors, city councilmen and women, they focus very much on the incentives that they're given. And Boris and I, before we came here, were talking about why we need a different governance structure, because we are in a different world now. And we are in a different world in water as well. So mayors are in office 4 years or 8 years or maybe 12 years. And I told you earlier, it takes 10 to 20 years to build out a water infrastructure system. So a mayor has almost no incentive from an electoral point of view to be focusing on what is an expensive infrastructure to build it out. He has lots of incentive to build parks and schools and hospitals, or to cut taxes. And so, therefore, that's what they do. And until citizens demand that there be more water smarts and more water activity, it's not going to come. Now, finally, in terms of your question about agriculture, it would be a bad idea, and I didn't make this clear in my remarks, and I should have, it would be a bad idea to be thinking of desalinating water for the purpose of growing crops. Because there are still water-rich parts in the world where it's easier to grow crops with local water, natural water, than using manufactured water. Manufactured water, as inexpensive as it has become relatively, is still, it's a cost. And therefore, you want to, if at all possible, not use desalinated water for agriculture, just because of the cost structure. Ideally, you use your desalinated water as a way of topping off your system, and not as a way of being your system. Now, we may reach a point because of climate change and the other macro conditions where we have no choice. Just as we agreed to spend $4 and $5 a gallon for our gas for our cars, we make a decision there's no other choice. There may come to that as well. But I would argue that the sooner we get started on thinking these things through, the sooner we get started on building out our infrastructure, the sooner we get started on thinking about governance and planning, the smarter that we'll be. You know, we do know something. We do know that there's going to be another drought. And that what happens is you have a couple of rainy days, you have a rainy season, and elected officials who don't want to spend money or who don't want to have new infrastructure or who don't think that we should build a desalination plant because it burns too much carbon fuel or because it adds salty water back into the ocean. I have answers to that as well. Within limits, it's not that big of a problem. They use that as an excuse to say, well, the aquifers are refilling, so why should we do this? And I think that's an abdication of very important and necessary leadership.
Could you comment on the fact that this, for Israel, you know, like it may have been a strategic, you know, like way of thinking, because obviously, you know, like the geography as such is one that forces you to, you know, like if you want to have a viable economy on this land, you need to think about the water issue. Is that something that helped sort of bridge the sort of bipartisanship that you might see in, let's say, the U.S., where, you know, like one group of politicians may be, you know, like supporting the people and, you know, like who are, you know, like owning the water rights, whereas the other may be more progressive and, you know, like trying to think about these things. So how's I guess my question is, how is the support, you know, like on both sides of the political, you know, like spectrum in Israel for this kind of projects, and where does it come from, and, you know, like what would be the lessons, you know, like for some of the other parts of the world?
Thank you. It's an important question, and it gives me the opportunity to actually speak of one of the several ways that our governance is broken here in the United States. Governance is not just the elected officials that we have. Governance is also the way we choose to conduct and control how we manage our water. So we have hundreds and thousands of different stakeholders in water here. And yet in Israel, what they made the decision to do was to build out a system and to give one single entity enormous control. It's a technocratic, apolitical body, and they make the decisions. And here's the remarkable thing. I interviewed 220 people for the book. We didn't get into it at all. I didn't talk much about, other than the fact that Israel gives water to the Palestinians. I wanted to understand the Palestinian water claims and the Israeli issues back and forth. So I spent a fair amount of time meeting with Palestinians and NGO heads and such to understand that issue. And I'm glad to talk about it if anyone has a question about it. But what was interesting was in the, call it maybe 190 other people that I spoke to, Israeli people, business executives, government officials, stakeholders in different parts of the water equation in Israel. What I was amazed by was the fact that not a single one of them suggested that even though Israel now has privatized its economy completely, and even though Israel now has, there's no state-owned bank, there's no state-owned airline, there's no state-owned telecommunications company, all those have been privatized in the Margaret Thatcher-style privatization. What shocked me was that not one person I spoke to, even when I pushed them, not professors, not economics professors, not bankers, no one I spoke to in the water equation told me that they thought it would be a good idea to make the free market a larger part of the water equation. And so what we have in the US is that, I mean, just to give one example of California, if you are along a river, let's say you're along the Colorado River, okay, and you have bad soil, mostly sandy soil, and you decide you want to grow cotton, which, again, no reason anyone should know this, but it's a highly water consumptive crop. And you decide you want to grow cotton, and you're right along the Colorado River. You can, under current structure, take all the water you want out of the river. There's no limits whatsoever. You can flood irrigate your field to your heart's content. Now, you can't then take the water and sell it to somebody else. It's public property in that regard. It's in the flow of property. But for where you're along the river, you take all you want, as much as you want, as often as you want. That would never fly in Israel. What they made the decision is that they need to think about what's in the best interest, the highest best use of a society altogether. Now, I want to just take issue with one part of your question, though, and that is the question about Israel had necessity in all of this. And I think that that was not necessarily true. Israel could have made the decision, as Singapore did, that it would have no agriculture at all. It could have made the decision that it would import 100% of its food, of its fruits and vegetables from Europe or from wherever. They could have made that decision. Now, there's some national security reasons. Israel is famously isolated. And unfortunately, because of time, I didn't have a chance to talk about what I call in the book hydrodiplomacy and the ways in which Israel opened the door to diplomatic relations with China and India through water technology. Israel understood China and India's severe water problems and used water as a door opener, which now they have robust and wonderful relations, but use it as a door opener to have relations with us too. But Israel could have made other choices. Israel made a decision to be a country like all other countries, to have a great agriculture sector, to feed their own people, not to feed their crops, not to feed their cattle. They feed their cattle and their chickens with fodder that's grown elsewhere. But all the fruits and vegetables they eat are mostly homegrown. And they made that decision. And so therefore they had to adopt their economy and their water plans accordingly. Now, just imagine if in the US, first of all, imagine that we had a water system, a water governance system that wasn't tied to a time that's closer to the 19th century, when there was few people out west, when there was abundant water, when no matter how much water that farmer upstream would take, there was still plenty more for people downstream. But I didn't finish the story. What's the problem? The problem is by the time that water gets far west, by the time it gets to Los Angeles, by the time it gets even to Nevada, it's a trickle. So you have Lake Mead now at a historic low. You ever seen those pictures of the Hoover Dam with those water lines? If not, if I may say, go to Google and do a search. It's really quite remarkable. And so you find yourself in a situation where we have ever less water, urgently needed, because we have a governance system. Now, I don't think it's a problem of one political party or the other. I think one political party is more given to its free market than the other, I think. But I think it's frankly that nobody is paying attention whatsoever. It's just off the radar screen, and that's a problem.
So as Boris mentioned, there is perhaps in the case of Israel, sort of like a nation state interest in, developing this desert. In the case of making the analogy to the US, where it's market-driven forces that really decide what happens, what is the alternative? Where do you see the future going as far, what are going to be the incentives? Why, we can't just bury our head in the sand and say, it's not a problem. It will bite us at some point.
Yeah, I think, look, I'm a great believer in, as I think everyone here is, in democracies. So the problem about democracies are that crucial decisions get pushed off for a very long time until they become crises. So the premise of your question implies a smart governance system where we move more rapidly. And I'm not as optimistic as you are. I see again and again in our history where we do ultimately address problems and address them well, but we address them late. And so therefore, terrible problems develop before we get there. But I tell you what I would like to see. I don't know that I will see. First of all, I'd like to just see immediately lots more technology at work. I'd like to see a different tax policy so that we have incentives for farmers so that they will adopt technology. I mean, think about this. If water is a free input, why would you spend 1 penny for technology to save water? It makes no sense. And I have a story that is an East Coast story, but people always can't quite believe it, but it's true. In 1980, in New York, well, let me step back. New York City gets its water from from the greater watershed. It's very healthy, good water. And it comes through these enormous water pipes that are probably about the size or maybe half the size of this large room that we're in right now. You could drive a truck through it, it's so large. And these are massive water pipes. There are 2 of them that feed New York. And in 1980, they discovered in one of the pipes that there was a leak in one of the pipes. And it wasn't just any leak. It was an unusually large leak. The leak was leaking 35 million gallons every single day. It's a lot of water. So if you were leaking 35 million gallons a day and there was a cost to that water of $1 a gallon or a penny a gallon or a tenth of a penny a gallon, what you would probably do is you'd probably pretty quickly do a cost-benefit analysis and say, got to fix the damn leak. But instead, the decision was made. They knew it was a problem. They knew sooner or later they'd have to fix it. But the attitude was infrastructure is expensive and water is free. So if water is free, why fix it? And so now we are 1980, 2000, 2010, so now we are 34 years later, is it? We're 35 years later, 2015, we're 35 years later. And here I'm going to tell you where we are. 35 million gallons a day. It's a lot of water. Last year, they made the decision to fix it. They have a 7-year project to fix it. It's going to cost about $1 billion. So 41 years after they discovered a leak, leaking 35 million gallons a day, it will be fixed. Now, that is a big story. Bring that down to microcosm, to a farmer. As long as water is free or functionally free, or highly subsidized, as long as it's highly subsidized for homeowners, we're going to keep doing silly, reckless things. So one of the things that Israel does, I didn't get a chance to talk about before, is it charges a real price for the water. But every penny that's charged goes to a locked box. It's used only for water infrastructure and water management. What happens in America is those same mayors I talked about before, they have water fees, they have sewage fees, goes to the general pot, goes to the general treasury, and they don't use it to fix the water. And so therefore they're happy to be sloppy with their water. And that's something that we can't afford. Maybe we could afford it once upon a time. I'm arguing that we cannot afford it going forward. So when do we fix it? We fix governance, we fix our infrastructure, we fix our financing system. We perhaps have some eminent domain where we say somebody's use of water is inappropriate for the rest of us. And we have to start thinking about this differently. And we have to have our federal government rethink the way it manages water. Because the management of water is back in a time when there were different society completely, not scarcity issues looming, and not the problems that we have today.
Hi, thank you so much. So I wanted to ask about, one thing you didn't mention much about was sort of stormwater and gray water, and I was wondering, do you think it's practical for us to actually separate out, there are many types of sewage in a sense, and in a lot of places, stormwater and sewage is all just the same and all goes to the same treatment plant, and then you end up with sewage overflowing when there's too much rain and so forth. Is it practical to actually develop sort of separate systems for stormwater, for gray water, for black water? I mean, gray water and stormwater are easier to treat and more reusable. Do you think that's a practical thing to do in the United States?
The answer is yes. I think it's doable. I think it's a question of prioritization. And you have to make a decision as to where you want to spend your water dollars. I think that probably there are possibly better dollars to be spent first. But I think this is one of these moments where you have to consider all options. And regionally speaking, in some places where you have lots of rain that gets lost to the sea is a good place to be thinking about this. I think storm capture water is a fabulous idea. I agree with you that it's not as easy to treat as you may think, by the way. Storm water, raindrops, when they fall from the sky, they're pretty pure. But the second they hit the soil, they pick up what's left from the car and truck and bus exhaust. And they pick up lots of silt and lots of sand. And so by the time they get into the treatment center, it's pretty dirty. It's filled with chemicals and it's pretty dirty stuff. But it's a good idea to have that as part of the mix, particularly in parts of the country where you have a significant amount of seasonal rain. So you can trap that rain, you can treat that rain, and then you can put it in large reservoirs where it can be used for later. And by the way, Israel does something just like that, but they haven't been doing that as much lately because they made the decision that it's actually more cost effective to take water from sewage, because there's a lot of it, and treat that and reuse that. But they have, as you saw in my chart, they have a little bit of stormwater recapture that they use now. But I think it may make more sense for parts of the United States that have seasonally high amounts of water, though. I hope that's helpful. Can I just say one last word I'd like to say is that the Middle East is a famous region for conflict. And most of what we see about Israel and the Middle East, unfortunately, we don't get a chance to see enough inspiring stories out of the Middle East. And there are many of those as well. This book, and I know Google very kindly is providing copies for everybody here, and thank you to Google for that. The book is actually, I think, full of inspiring stories of people overcoming insurmountable obstacles. And I think that this is one such story that is one that's good for all of us to hear. And I hope that this is something that people understand is not just sort of an engineering story, but a story that is applicable to all of our lives and large challenges that we face in society generally, which is sort of the way Boris kindly started this whole conversation. So I think that I think that we're probably at the end of our hour, and I thank you all very, very much for your time and attention. If anybody wants to linger after we finish, I'd be glad to stand by and speak with those of you who are shy, if any of you are. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Seth for coming to give it.